delighted to have a chance to interact with a group that is too often below the radar screen, but is doing some terrific work throughout the state of Iowa. And I think is it 15 years, David? It might
be 15 next year. 15
next year that it was started. Father Osterberg and friend, and the source of it. And so we're going to have a chance to meet three of the principals tonight and see what they have to say. I know they will welcome questions, but let me introduce Mike Owen now. And Mike, just by way of background, was a reporter for the Quad City Times. He was the owner and operator of his own newspaper, and he has been with the project for
14 years.
14 years. And Mike Owen, please, welcome.
Thank you, Bob. I first met Bob when I was a Quad City Times reporter in Des Moines. He was a state senator at the time, so this is back in the early 80s. And, I was just thinking on the way up here, I really wish in those days we had something like the Iowa Policy Project around. In those days, we didn't even have the internet. And there was, as you can imagine, just as it is now, a lot of information being batted back and forth in the state capitol. And I think people have a hard time, especially if they're not used to that atmosphere and they're just maybe reading their Cedar Rapids Gazette or watching local TV. They're probably a little uncertain of who to believe, what to believe. I come from a journalism background, and when I was at the Capitol, I could pick out people who I think would give you a straight scoop on stuff. And one of them was Bob Rush, and one of them was David Osterberg. So when my wife and I sold our newspaper, the West Branch Times, back in 2001, it just happened that the IPP was just getting going, getting off the ground. They were looking for somebody to be doing communications work. And I had been exposed to an early publication that they did, that Peter Fisher, who you hear from, had done about Social Security and myths about what Social Security taxes were doing in terms of people migrating from the state. And I could see, these were serious people, and I really wanted to be involved with that. And I think that through the 14 years that we've been around, and David and Peter are have been the two who've been there from the beginning, our credibility has never been challenged. We have people who don't like us maybe because they don't like solutions that we come up with. But the idea behind the Iowa Policy Project is to make sure that the political debates, no matter what your political perspective is, that we first have a sound foundation of facts, that the research is good, that the facts we're using are relevant, and that these are the things that have to be discussed in the political arena, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or anything else. That those are the critical things. And if we can get Republicans and Democrats focused on those kinds of issues and engaged with their constituents, and their constituents engaging them on those issues and a common set of facts, then let's have those vigorous debates about the best ways to move forward. Whether it's the minimum wage or clean water strategies or tax policy. I think that what we've seen through the years is that certainly in the last 10, 15 years, things have gotten so, I don't know what the right term is, out of hand, out of control. Maybe it doesn't need to be controlled, but everybody's at loggerheads, and they don't seem to be able to talk to each other. So let's get back to the basics and focus on those good facts for public policy issues. Let's talk about water for just a moment before I introduce Dave. my wife and I, before we had our local newspaper, we'd moved out of the state to Pennsylvania, came back, and the weekend that we bought the West Branch Times newspaper, we went to meet some friends up at Clear Lake. And our little 4-year-old son was splashing around in the water up at Clear Lake. There are a lot of lakes and streams that you wouldn't let your 4-year-old in right now in this state. It wasn't the way it was just that short time ago, about 20 years ago. We have to deal with these issues. So David Osterberg has been working on this issue for many years, long before he started the Iowa Policy Project with Mark Smith back in the early 2000s. And I think he's going to talk a little bit about that today. And when we're finished with that, David is going to turn it over to Peter Fisher, and Peter's going to talk about some other issues that we've been working on at the Iowa Policy Project. And then maybe we can have some discussion about some of those issues or questions about who we are, what we do, why we're talking about the issues we are. Just kind of open it up to a good discussion. So thank you very much for coming on a Sunday afternoon. Thank you to Bob and Judy very much for hosting us. We sure appreciate it. And they've been supporters of us for a long time, and we appreciate that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Osterberg, who's the former executive director. He's the founder, and he is, I can't remember what title we give you now, founding director or something like that. But he's still around, even though he's not the director anymore.
Well, just to show you how coordinated we are, I'm not going to talk about water. I'm going to talk about another issue. The main thing we just finished, which was not really well received. We got a great front page above the fold article from Orland Love, because it was about the REAP program, Resource Enhancement and Protection. A program that takes already existing organizations and just gives them a little more money. The whole idea behind REAP is we're not going to have a whole lot more state employees. That's why we got a 100% vote on this thing. We are simply going to go to the Conservation Commission and each of the counties and give them a little more money. And give money to state parks, give money to city parks, give money to soil and water conservation, history, roadside vegetation, those kinds of things. And we decided that I wanted to do a paper on the value of REAP. And since it's 14,000 some individual projects over 25 years, that was way beyond anybody's capacity to do. So we decided to do it in one county, Lynn, kind of what I was familiar with. And we looked at a way of trying to say, what is the value? We can say how much money has gone into Lynn County for REAP projects. $6 million, $7 million in the first 25 years. But what's it worth? And so the idea was to look at the economics literature. I used to be an economics professor. I used to follow that literature. And natural resource economics at one time was pretty exciting because they were trying to figure out ways of putting values on things like losing a species. What is that worth to not lose some butterfly? Or, you know, how do we figure out a valuation for something? Or if somebody likes the idea of Yellowstone Park, even though she's never going to get there, it's worth something. And so what is that value? So we started looking at REAP and immediately decided we could not do what we thought we were going to do because of the very breadth of REAP. So it was not only that I would have to compare more money going to the Czech and Slovak Museum or to the African American Museum, both of which I can see from this window, and to improve their collections, and then figure out that extra amount brought in some more people, and I can value that in terms of people staying in hotels and eating and things like that, I mean, that's a legitimate way of doing that. Okay, there's a history, and history has some value, but then you also have to look at Mount Vernon, Iowa, where we had a giant fire in Main Street, and an 1890s building just was gutted. They were changing it over to a different kind of firm that was going to be in there. And obviously, the thing that the owners could have done is just knock the thing down, put up a cement building, and then go forward. But people there, the Historic Commission in Mount Vernon, actually chaired by my wife, Kay Johansson, who's got a grant for $25,000 to stabilize that, put a new roof on, and because of that, they went forward, and we now have a bar, but it's an 1890s bar that is beautiful, and it keeps the old Mount Vernon beauty, and that stays the same. So you don't go along and see 1890s, 1872, 1894, 2012. You don't see that. You see the continuation of that. And that's value, and there's some value there. So even when it came to figuring out what is the value of the spending in history in Lynn County, it was going to be really nearly impossible to compare that to a new bathroom at Palisades Capital, or the fact that Wakey Uphill got a bunch more ground and was protecting it, or that there was soil conservation, expansion, and a little river was made better. And so we started out, and we didn't do exactly what we said we were going to do. It was fun because I got to look at that literature again that I hadn't looked at recently. It was good because it was helping train a graduate student. I did this with somebody from urban and regional planning. And it was good because it gave us the opportunity to talk about what REAP had done for Lynn County. And then we could also talk about how you would value these things. But we were never able to come up with a number that says this is the value of REAP in Lynn County. But we still thought it was an important piece to put out. It allowed us to say all of those things that REAP had done, and it allowed us to talk about how you would try to make value judgments, and whether or not it was worth the $6 million that we had spent. But that's what we could do. And so we looked at that, and because we're a policy organization, you have to go the next step to say, what is the policy implication of this? And the policy implication was that we have a Mary Lundy Bridge over the Wapsie, named after Mary Lundy because she, I have to say it, and Ron got the REAP license plates put together. So had lots to do with that organization, and consequently people, you guys I guess, made that bridge and named it after her. But the point here is that there are so many things that have been done. There is a way of valuating, but we couldn't really do the valuation. But what we could say is there's only one of those bridges, and if we had fully funded REAP, there might be a lot more in other counties. Because REAP was supposed to get $20 million a year. And $20 million times 25 years, people can do that math, that's $500 million. The amount spent was $280. Whereas the other stuff, it was never fully appropriated. REAP was never fully appropriated. We were never able to do that. There's one of the implications. So you say, this is a story we're telling you about REAP, and this is the policy implication, and that is that it has been underfunded. And if you value those things that we've just talked about, and there's a way of evaluating that we can show you the good literature on, then is that an issue that the legislature should look at again and maybe decide that they will spend more? And we could also say, when the legislature got together in a nonpartisan way and decided that on the 25th anniversary of REAP it ought to get $25 million, and it would have, except the governor vetoed $9 million. That's another piece of that. So that kind of tells you, I think, it's an example of how we do policy research, or how you do policy research. First is you don't know the answer before you start. I didn't know where the study was going to go. I thought it was going to be a very different study until I discovered I couldn't do what I wanted. Secondly, when you get to getting after the study, you have data. And that data is not conservative or liberal, it's data. And unless you cherry pick those numbers in order to try to show something that may not really be there, that's data. And so, as an organization that does public policy, we don't know the answer before we start. We make sure that we don't throw away data just because it's inconvenient. And we also make sure that when we do a piece like this, we try to tell people as best as we can, this is the facts, these are the facts. And you can decide then whether you think that we're spending too much money and we shouldn't do any more in REAP, and therefore $280 million is fine, maybe it's too much. But then somebody has to listen to a constituent who says, are these not the facts? And is it not true that you should have spent $500 million and you guys only spent 280, those guys included me, because that was a few years I was in when we didn't fully fund REAP. That's policy research. And that's what we do at Iowa Policy Project. And this is an example that comes from one of the areas that we work in, which is water quality and energy. And there's also a whole lot more things we do that Peter Fisher was hired to do. And I think he's going to talk about, well, we'll find out.
So this is sort of a second career for me. I taught at the University of Iowa in the urban planning program for about 35 years, retired some years ago. Started working at the Iowa Policy Project part-time, and actually started there as a board member in 2000, and since become the research director. One of my previous visits to Cedar Rapids some years ago was also a possibility of a second career. I was invited to come to the Unitarian Church and talk about economics, so I decided to bring my guitar. And they advertised me through a typo as the singing exonomist. I talked about, I had a number of songs on depression and actually I used to lecture on economics, but decided it was not a profitable second career. Went back to the University of Iowa. And since I joined the Iowa Policy Project, I've been doing what I really love to do, which is policy work. So the area I'm going to talk about is economic opportunity. And I think the overarching principle that guides what we do in that area is something that few people I think would take issue with, and that is that if the state has an interest in economic policy, it's in increasing prosperity. It's not just counting jobs. It's about making people better off, and not just greater prosperity, but prosperity that's shared broadly. That we should be figuring out ways to move more people into the middle class. So one of the things that we've been doing for 7 or 8 years now to help inform that sort of policy area is something called the cost of living in Iowa. So we set out to figure out, what is a middle class standard of living? What is even a very basic middle class standard of living in Iowa and in all 99 counties in the state? That's a report that we put out every 2 years. I'm starting to work on the 2016 edition now. So one of the things we found that for most families, just meeting the basic costs of rent, health care, housing, transportation, child care was going to cost, it required an amount of income that was roughly twice the poverty level. Poverty level is really not an adequate measure of what it takes to get by. So then we did a couple of things as extensions of that. It's actually been our most requested talk. We've spoken across the state with United Way organizations, with the Des Moines Rotary Club, with the Community College trustees. We've done webinars for the Iowa Council of Foundations. Local United Way boards, etc. And what we've done is not just sort of educate people on what it actually takes to get by in this state, but to look at the policy side of it, because that's what we do. So we've developed an analysis out of this of what happens to various work support programs as you earn more income. What are you eligible for? Where are you sort of dropped off the rolls of housing assistance, food stamps, Medicaid, the Hawkeye program, etc. And what we found is that most of those programs are geared to sort of gradually phase out benefits. The one that doesn't is child care assistance. It's a very important program for any family. Parents are trying to work, but they have a child that needs full-time child care, which is very expensive. And what happens is that you hit about 145% of poverty. Remember, it takes twice poverty just to get by. You're all of a sudden dumped off the program altogether. It's not a gentle thing. It's called a cliff. And you are dropped off the cliff, and it costs you, all of a sudden, you've got $8,000 or $9,000 a year in child care for if you have a couple of kids that you've got to pay for entirely out of your own pocket. So this has gotten the attention of people in the state, and we keep working with legislators, the governor's office, the head of DHS is very much on board. It's something, in fact, something needs to be done in this area, but it hasn't happened yet. The other thing, I guess, that comes out of this work is the recognition that broadly shared prosperity requires higher wages. We can't do it all through assistance programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, child care assistance. People need to be able to earn a subsistence income, decent income. People who work full-time year-round should not be living in poverty, which has led us to another area of our work that's been focused recently, which is, well, actually, it's something we've talked about every year since, when did we do the first State of Work?
2001.
2000?
2001.
2001, okay, is the need for a higher minimum wage. If you're going to talk about raising the incomes of people at the bottom, it's one of the most effective things you can do. The last time the minimum wage in Iowa was raised was, okay, Mike, what's the year?
2007.
2007, okay.
Took effect in Owen.
And then the federal, since that time, the federal minimum wage governed because we have not taken a step above the federal. So like a lot of other places across the country, cities and counties, seeing that the federal government isn't doing anything, the state legislature isn't doing anything about the minimum wage, localities have started talking about doing their own, and there's 24 now that have a higher minimum wage for the city or for the county than the federal. Another 10 or so that are thinking about doing it, now including Johnson County. So we did a report on what a higher minimum wage. We talked about $15. If you look at the cost of living in Iowa, that's not even going to get you there. If you're a family, a single parent with even just one child in child care, that's not going to be enough. You're still going to need work supports of some kind or another. It looks like the Johnson County is focusing on $10.10, which is still a pretty substantial increase. So I'll just conclude with a couple of things. When we do a report like that, what we wanted to do was look at a couple of issues. One is getting a sense of who are the people that would benefit from a higher minimum wage. And it turns out it's not just teenagers earning money so they can make a car payment for a car that they only need to get to the job. This sort of mythology about teenagers. Most of the minimum wage workers are over age 20. Many of them have families. Many of them are in their prime earning years. It provides a significant share of the income. An increase in the minimum wage would boost the incomes of people who are important breadwinners in their family, not just people earning tin money. And the second one was to talk about the jobs effect. So there was during the debate in Johnson County, it came out that somebody had latched onto this information from Seattle about all the jobs that had been lost there when they went to something close to $12 an hour, on their way to 15, April of this year, April 1st. The wage was boosted to 11 or 12. And supposedly there were all these jobs lost in the restaurant and bar industry, which is one of the industries you would expect to be hiring a lot of minimum wage workers. So first of all, that turned out not to be true. In fact, the latest jobs numbers have come out showing that restaurant job employment in the Seattle metro area actually has increased in the 3 months since the minimum wage went up. Which doesn't mean that the minimum wage caused employment to go up. It just means that you can raise the minimum wage and not see a big loss of jobs. And the other thing we did was look at the research. Look at all the places where minimum wage has gone up. Look at counties where one county had one minimum wage and the one next door was in a different state that had raised their minimum wage. So did the county with the higher minimum wage lose all their jobs? No, the research, two major research studies looking at hundreds of counties over 20 years said no, there is no discernible effect on employment. And one of the reasons is that all those people making that higher wage have more money in their pockets and they're spending it in local businesses, and that helps to offset the effect of the increase in cost of some businesses. So anyway, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to inform public debates like the one on the minimum wage, so that they're based on information and not on mythology. So I guess I'll leave it at that. And we're going
So David talked about some of our environment work. We also do energy, so that's kind of his area, of energy and environment. Peter talked about family prosperity, sorts of issues. And the other big area that we cover is tax and budget. Now, if you just look at those three general areas, there's a lot of interconnections there. And, of course, I know nobody here probably has views about taxes. A lot of our work on taxes has been similar to what they've been describing. How can we help people understand what the reality is on taxes when there's so much spin out there? Fact is, and we've seen this for years, you don't hear it a lot from the politicians, Iowa is actually a middle of the road to low tax state. You don't hear that from people. It's not convenient to political arguments when you're trying to stir people up. But in fact, by any measure, when you're looking at where we stack up versus other states, business taxes, state and local taxes on business, on individuals, effective tax rates, not focusing on what a marginal rate level is in a schedule, but what people are actually paying, you find out that we actually are in the middle to below. Average by any measure is what we typically say. What you find out if you actually look at the data on taxes is that the bottom 80% of Iowa taxpayers are paying about 10% of their income in state and local taxes. And at the very top, it's more like 6%. We have a regressive tax system, and we have proposals that come in the legislature. There was just one this past spring that would have moved for a flat income tax option. It would have cost the state almost $500 million in the first year and about $400 million in succeeding years. And at the same time, it would have made our tax system even more inequitable than it is now, because it would have been lowering the only progressive part of our system. It would have been making it possible for high-income taxpayers to be paying a lower rate than they are now. It would not have benefited people in the bottom and the middle. So we're here to keep putting those kinds of stats out and to show you where it comes from. And it's well documented in our reports. We have a couple of them. As you came in today, there were a few of our reports there. The child care issue that Peter mentioned is covered in one of those. Finally, I would say that what we try to do with all these things is connect the dots. Because a lot of these issues have a bearing on another one, it's important to be able to tie the question of what it takes to get by versus how our tax system is treating people at levels where it's hard to get by. And what work supports are we offering? We're not going to raise the minimum wage, for example. We're going to leave it down at $7.25. What are we doing to make sure that people who, as Peter mentioned, are working full-time and trying to get their family by at those low wages, what are we doing to make sure that they can do that? And there are public policy answers there. Let's have those debates, but let's understand what the foundation is that those debates should be on. I think that's about all I wanted to say about that issue, and I kind of touched on the tax part. Peter does a lot of our tax work too, so if you have questions about any of these issues, let's talk. Judy.
Good question. So hypothetically, Steve Sovereign, who's on the South Side Investment Board here in New Bohemia, contacts you and says, you know, the board really wants to quantify and understand a policy issue surrounding economics, flood, what type of businesses, you know, that kind of thing. And as a result of the study, we would like to go to the City Council. So I guess my question is, how do you get in the door? What's the decision-making process on doing an analysis? And do you have some preconditions where, you know, if it's something like a local group, no, we're not going to do that. Curious, how do you decide?
You know, we haven't faced that choice very often. I've only been the director for this, I'm going into my third year here. But I don't know if David's run into a lot of those. When we have done on occasion a contract research, I'd say our main condition, however, would always be we decide what the report says. You know, we're not gonna contract for a report where somebody's just trying to look for their preordained answer and they want us to put our stamp of approval on it. Because, as I said at the beginning, the way we view it, our credibility is everything. And it's our strongest asset, a smaller company.
Yeah, I don't think we've had many times when somebody has come to us and say, here's $500 million, we'd like you to do this study.
Yeah.
Everybody here, by the way, is able to donate to this organization, just so you know that.
We didn't mention that, but that's true. We are a 501c3 organization, and we take contributions, we welcome contributions, and it needs to be actually individual contributions need to be a bigger part of our funding base. But we can work with others as well.
So
it's
mostly internal that you identify the issues?
Well, that's a good question, Judy, because, for instance, the REAP, it was something I wanted to do. And partly, again, as I said, I wanted to do it because I wanted to look at that literature, and I hadn't looked at it for a while. But it also seemed like REAP was the kind of issue that people supported. And to find out just what had happened in Lynn County, I thought was a good idea. I thought we were going to be able to do more on that. I really thought we were going to be able to say, you know, we put $7 million into Lynn County, and the payoff has been $47 million. We couldn't do it. But I think just simply by saying there is a way to evaluate this stuff, this is how much has been spent, and you know, if we'd spent more, there'd be more of this kind of stuff. And if you like it, maybe you ought to say something to the people who represent you. I mean, as I said, including me, because when I was in, we never got the $20 million.
So that was more something that you wanted to do. We have a small group, a small staff, and we want to be relevant. And so when issues are live in our state, whether it's a minimum wage or a tax proposal or something, we evaluate whether we can appropriately get into that. And minimum wage is something we've looked at a long time. How to count jobs is something we've been doing since 2003. You know, all these kinds of issues.
So we have some
first thing.
Yeah, we have foundation support that says we want you to work for us in the environmental area. We have a foundation that supports general work in the tax and budget area. But they leave it up to us to decide what's the important issue that's timely, and where you have some expertise and can contribute to the debate, and that's how we pick projects.
And another thing, McKnight funds us for,
Right.
McKnight is a wonderful organization out of the Twin Cities. And they've been funding us for 10 years. And when I make a proposal to them, I'd say, I'd like to do this study, I'd like to do this study, but you know, if something comes up, I'm going to do that and not do this. Mm-hmm. And so far, they've been okay on that. They want to know in general what we're going to do, but no one's ever said, and we want to make sure that you say this. Nobody's ever said that. I don't think you do that.
And another major foundation that funds us is the Stoneman Family Foundation.
Right.
And that's on budget and tax work, and they put no stipulations on what we should be looking at. They just want to know we're doing the work. We report to them regularly, but that's been a big part of our work. And what's interesting there is that is part of a network. They are one of about 4 or 5 big foundations that fund something called the State Priorities Partnership. And they help groups in that. We're one of 40 state groups that are in this network. And what's neat about that is that when people are doing groundbreaking work, it helps the entire network. Peter has done, we talked earlier about the whole issue of who do you believe? You know, you get all the spin out there and so forth. One of the things that is very prominent in the news every time is somebody comes out with a study and ranks the states based on taxes or whatever. And they're all over the map, literally, because you're going to have various, Peter should be talking about this, not me, it's his research. But just in a nutshell, you have all these different rankings out there, and states are ranked like this. Peter's looked at that, and he dissects how they come up with the rankings. And he's written 2 books on the subject. And we're going to have something interesting coming out this fall about that very issue. But it's something where Peter's work in Iowa is going to help 39 other groups in the country that are like us, trying to help people in their states sort out the issues. Because Peter had the initiative and the expertise to do this. Did I summarize that properly?
Yeah.
Mike, have you, your organization, taken a position on the funding for the 3/8 penny sales tax for the Iowa Water and Legacy Fund?
We have not taken a position on that issue.
Have you done any research relating to that issue and whether you would be supportive of that or not?
I'm not sure we would take a position on it, but we probably could look at whether, how the impact would fall on various, by income.
Has anyone asked you to do that or work on that issue?
I think so. We had something.
I don't think they've asked us, no. But, we know in general how the sales tax is distributed, who pays, by income level, and that's certainly one of the things, if we were to look at these, one of the things that we would look at. I mean, it's a sales tax, and it is a more regressive way of financing something like that than some of the alternatives.
One of the questions we probably would have is knowing that it would have a regressive impact. It would affect people at lower incomes more than people at higher incomes. Is there some way that you can offset that? If that makes sense. If it's the only way that you can get the resources, for example. Are there other alternatives that you might want to look at to balance that out?
Right, or what would it take in order to make it more neutral? What would you have to do in some other tax to offset that? That's probably the approach we take.
As far as taking a position, we'd rather put the research out there. In most cases, sometimes we do take a position on things. It's pretty clear we're in favor of a minimum wage increase. We haven't come out for any number, but we think a minimum wage increase in the state of Iowa is essential. But on the 3/8 penny, I think that's probably one of those issues we'll be more inclined to want to be able to get information out and let the process take its course.
Yes, sir. When you were talking about the minimum wage and I was not raising it, it struck me that that's another way that we, in effect, subsidize business when you take into account what we have to do to offset what people don't earn in order to be able to make their way, which also led me to...
You mean if you don't raise the wage that you're subsidizing?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The public assistance programs that have to kick in.
The public assistance that has to kick in, and then the emergency room things, and and all of those things. So that led me to wonder about all the other ways that Iowans subsidize business. By, say, we reduced the corporate tax by 5%, and we shifted that to the property tax of residential people. Then we give these direct grants to people, like the fertilizer company and that sort of thing, and then we have these tax abatements, property tax abatements, and so on. So I wonder if somebody's kind of put all that together and say, this is what we spend per taxpayer to subsidize the businesses that are in our state.
I think we'd like to know that. We're quite ambitious.
Yeah, we're pretty ambitious. Yeah.
In concept, it's an interesting idea.
So the short answer is no.
Short answer is I think it would be pretty difficult to get it all that in a time frame that we need to.
So what would have been the merits of the state tax credit policies to businesses? Like he just mentioned fertilizers plant.
Yeah. Well, we did look a little bit at that one, and I think what I guess the trouble is the total amount of money. I mean, it seems that the state ought to have. I mean, when you looked at that deal and how many millions of dollars per job you're spending, you had to ask, is there any limit to what we would spend to get a job? Because that was so much more than anything we'd seen previously. And also, was it necessary in the first place? Because, when I looked into it, I found that the site they were considering in Illinois
Was the fertilizer plant, right?
We're talking about Erasmus fertilizer, right? Yeah. Wasn't eligible for these federal tax-exempt bonds, which was worth a huge amount of money to the company already. Iowa was. So we started out with a big advantage, and I'm not sure. I mean, the question we would raise is whether you need to do anything beyond that to get them to come. But that's it. you know, it's a difficult question to answer directly, but you would hope that the state would have some criteria and some limits on what they're willing to spend to get another job.
What are your focuses on legislation? It's been a while since I've been in law school, and we never really talked about someday somebody might pass a law that makes it okay to lie in the media, not to tell people what they're eating. This is the rabbit hole. Are you doing anything in that area? Legislative?
Well, we tend to look at issues, and we look at issues that are either already being discussed in the State House, or there are groups that want to see them discussed, or just we think are important and ought to be part of the discussion. We don't tend to look at particular bills. That's the question you're asking. But I mean, oftentimes you know, in the course of talking about this issue over a legislative session, there'll be a bill introduced. But you know, we don't take a position on the bill, but we've already put out reports that we think help inform the debate on the bill. I think that's our role to have it.
Now and then we do look at a bill and try and sort out what the effects of it would be. But
Yeah, that's
where the
true.
difference is.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily, we usually don't lobby. In the 501c3 charitable organization, we can only do a limited amount on the honor of that.
Right, and a limited amount, and nobody knows how much that is. Because they don't tell you, but we have to. So anytime we have something that we say might be lobbying, we write it down, even though it doesn't seem like it. But very little of our time is spent on that. It's research on questions, and the questions, again, an example of the question came from me. I just wanted to answer. I wanted to answer that question. Oftentimes during the legislative session, someone will propose a tax change, and then we will analyze it.
Right.
So it's not that we are lobbying for or against, but we just say, if you want to do this,
This is what will happen.
this is going to happen to you.
Sometimes we're asked by legislators, or even when legislators are maybe preparing to introduce something, they'll talk to us just to get some sense of some of the issues that they'll want to look at.
Yes, Steve's been trying to ask a question.
Well, my question will probably now, in the last 4 minutes, become less purposeful. But it may give new definition to the elephant in the room. But Ron's recent video sort of characterizes the ivory tower liberal think tanks, and that they need to generate a conservative think tank, I think, to compete. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, we can't afford the rent in an ivory tower. So,
Yeah,
we work out of an 18th century church building.
So you don't identify with that characterization?
No, I mean, I think it's a lot less glamorous than that idea. I mean, we see issues and we talk about them. There's a lot of collaboration within our organization. It's easy to do when right now there's the three of us and one more person. We have a board and we touch base with them, but we pretty much do most of the deciding on what we're going to work on, and it just comes from a lot of discussion, and it might be something as simple as what we saw in the newspaper that day. So the ivory tower, we're not out there dreaming up things to do. There's plenty to do. There's plenty to do.
and maybe, it's the question more than the analysis. If we do something on the minimum wage, it's not just because we didn't have anything else to do, but we think that that's an important piece for Iowa. But when you do the analysis and you say, these are going to be the consequences of raising the minimum wage, and if you will or won't be losing jobs because you did, I mean, neoclassical economic theory says, raise the wage, you have to have less work. Turns out, when the studies have been done, the empirical evidence just is not there. you don't see that happening when you do raise your minimum wage. When here's Pennsylvania and here's New York, and one raises and the other doesn't, and you cannot see any effect on that. So for us to say that, we are looking at a question, and if that would be liberal or not, the data isn't. The data is the data. And we produce that. And you don't, the only way you can say this would be conservative, this could be liberal or progressive, is you throw away a bunch of your data. This is what makes me really unhappy on climate change, okay? Here you have, this is, in this axis, how much ice you have, sea ice. And here is the number of years. And when you look at the data, you find it goes like this, up and down, up and down, up and down. But over 20 years, it goes down. If you find somebody who says, in 2014, the amount of sea ice went up, so what is about global warming, huh? Because they threw away all the other data that showed it did go up in 2014. Yes, it did. But it had gone the other way in 13. And if you look at the total amount of time, there is no question what has happened. That is liberal versus conservative. And that is just the misuse of the whole idea of research. So I maintain research is not liberal or conservative. Questions, the reason we look at that question, maybe you can say that, yeah, they're just two, goody two-shoes types and they care about poor people. Yeah.
And another thing is, we're not doing this in a vacuum. It's not some academic thing, just for we don't research these things for the sake of doing it. We want people to be able to engage our legislators, engage our public officials. It's in our mission statement that you can read on our website. And you do that by drawing common sense analysis of things that are on the table. And the longer we're here, the longer we can make those connections between one issue and another. For example, what was probably one of the biggest issues of the last legislative session? Education funding, right? So the schools, in my other life, I'm a school board member in West Branch, so I was watching this pretty closely anyway. So we get 1.25% per pupil increase. To add 1% to that would have cost about $35 million. As it happens, what we know from other research we do, in 2014, the state of Iowa gave away $35 million under the guise of the research activities credit to companies that pay no income tax to the state of Iowa. $35 million here, or $35 million here for schools. Now, the reason this happened is this was not all part of the same budget process, or at least arguably that's a reason. Legislators were never forced to go and choose, okay, we're going to put $35 million into these big companies, mainly big companies, that paid no income tax. Or we're going to put $35 million into schools and get maybe a little closer, still below, but a little closer to the way we traditionally funded them. Legislators never had to make that choice because this $35 million was spent before they even started working on the budget. Those are the kind of connections we make for people, and I think that's kind of a common sense comparison that people could choose. Now maybe they want to do it this way, and that's fine, but at least we've drawn it out there for people to see, and you can bet that it's not something that's necessarily going to be promoted by every member of the Iowa General Assembly or the governor. Sir.
You referenced the data, and I've been accused by my council members of using too much data. But my question is, so how do you obtain the data, and then secondly, how do you validate that the data is clean data that you're using? Because bad data gets you bad results.
The research director worked on that.
Well, a lot of it comes from, I mean, we use a lot of publicly available data. Most of the questions that we research, it's available from the Census Bureau or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And, that's very reputable, sound data, despite the attempts of a year or so ago to pretend that the unemployment numbers were politically rigged or something. You know, it's nonsense. So, what other? I mean, we're pretty transparent, I think, about where the data comes from. And you're right. There are some times when you need to check. Go back to the original source because you're using what somebody else looked at the table and what they thought it said. But yeah, it's just a matter of being conscientious about knowing what your data source actually says, what conclusion you can draw from it, and what you can't. And when the margin of error is so large, you shouldn't be talking about that number to begin with, because it's pretty meaningless. Yeah, I'm not sure how else to.
Yeah, oftentimes it's a question of data versus, well, I heard this, and often it's, you know, just somebody said something and that person decides to believe it. So oftentimes just bringing data to the discussion is an improvement over what was there before.
And you have to be transparent with the source of the two. Right. So people can look at it for themselves.
Right.
Everybody finds that that's the same number.
And that's what goes back to what I said early on, that the work these guys have been doing for all this time, it's not been challenged. People don't like the results. They might use some, oh, that's just some group by the University of Iowa, whatever. But the data has not been challenged.
But and people can disagree on the interpretation of the data.
Sure. Exactly.
But as long as they agree on the data itself,
Yeah.
that's a good first step.
I agree.
We have a refrigerator magnet that says the nice thing about science is it's true whether you believe it or not.
So in addition to perhaps, you're open to financial support, would it be a tax deductible contribution?
It would.
Okay, and also, are you open to ideas coming from the general public about projects that we might think would have merit in doing some research on?
Sure. I want to hear what people have to say. We have, and go on our website and communicate with us, and you can sign up for our email newsletters, which we don't put out as often as the politicians do. You know, I was looking at my email before we came in here today, and there's 20 or 30 from 3 or 4 people. They get antsy at the end of the month. We only send them. We send emails out about once every 2 weeks or so. It's really not more frequent than that, and they're focused on what we're doing. In all places, we offer a way to contribute to us too, but the focus is, you know, we think that this may be naive, okay, but I think that the funding part theoretically should take care of itself if more people are using our stuff. You know, we'd like to have a lot of use of information by the Iowa Policy Project, and then more people around the state, of course, would be interested in contributing to it. But yeah, it's all part of the puzzle.
Well, thank you guys very much.
Thank you. And Judy.